Welcome to TSG's Knowledge Share on FDA's pre-market regulation of devices. A little about me. I'm Laurie Clarke, and I'm the head of TSG's Medical Device Regulatory Practice. I have more than 25 years' experience practicing FDA law, though I am now an FDA consultant and not practicing law. And I was an FDA partner at 3 top-ranked law firms. I have expertise in helping medical device companies develop and implement regulatory strategies that meet their marketing objectives. I have a law degree from Stanford University, a master's in public policy with a concentration in health policy from Harvard University, and an undergraduate degree from Smith College. Today, we're going to talk about FDA's legal and regulatory framework, the definition of a medical device, FDA's risk-based classification of medical devices, and the 3 primary paths to market a medical device, which are 510(k) pre-market notification, de novo review of automatic Class 3 classification, and pre-market approval applications. We're also going to talk about FDA's regulation of clinical studies, and then we're going to do a case study about FDA's first cleared hair growth device. And then I'm going to give you some regulatory tips at the end of this presentation, which is worth staying to hear. The legal and regulatory framework. The statute that governs all regulation of medical devices is the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act as amended. It authorizes FDA to regulate medical devices, and it sets broad perimeters for FDA's regulation. The next level is FDA's device regulations. They implement the device provisions of the FDC Act, and they have the force of law. FDA's guidance document and policies, they interpret both the statute and the regulations, so they're more specific. And there are general ones, such as biocompatibility that apply to all devices. And there are device-specific ones, such as for surgical apparel. Technically, these are non-binding FDA recommendations. But if FDA puts together a guidance document or policy, you either need to follow them or justify why you don't follow them, and you have to have a pretty good justification for FDA to accept it. The next level of regulation and guidance is FDA recognized consensus standards, such as IEC 60601, which deals with electrical safety. They sets forth test protocols and acceptance criteria. And for some standards, FDA has accepted the entire standard, and others they've accepted partial standard, and so they accept it for certain devices and not all devices. Again, compliance is technically voluntary, but if FDA recognizes a standard, you either need to comply with it or have a justification for not complying with it. Another strong governing force in FDA's regulation of medical devices is what FDA has done in the past. So it's both precedents and predicates in the 510(k) realm. If FDA has cleared a similar device, you base your clearance on that similarities to that other device. What is a device? The FDC Act has a 3-part definition of a device. The first part is its technological characteristics, which it defines as an instrument, apparatus, implement, machine, contrivance, implant, in vitro reagent, or similar or related articles, which is very broad, or a component, part, or accessory of them. So a component, part, or accessory is a subset of a device, but it's also a device in its own right. It also has to have one of the following primary purposes. It's recognized in the National Formulary or the U.S. Pharmacopoeia. In 30 years of doing FDA law and FDA consulting, I've never seen a single device that has been considered a device based on that criteria. An alternative criteria is it's intended for use in the diagnosis of disease or other conditions, or the cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease. The third of those alternative criteria are it's intended to affect the structure or any function of the body. And it has to also have a primary mode of action, and it can't be by chemical action on or within the body or dependent on it being metabolized. And the reason is this distinguishes a device from a drug, which has those primary mode of actions, chemical or metabolic. The statute also excludes certain software functions, such as medical records, from the definition of a device. FDA regulates many products as a device that on their face may not seem to meet the definition. And that's because FDA interprets the definition of a device very broadly. For example, technological characteristics. If you look at the picture, the top left-hand side, those are medical leeches. Nowhere does it say live creatures as part of the definition of a device, but they are regulated by FDA as a device. The primary purpose, diseases or conditions that include what we consider normal body functions. As the picture on the far upper right shows, it's a breast pump. Lactation is considered a condition, and FDA regulates breast pumps. And the third one is the impact on the body. And you don't have to have a health benefit. For example, the picture on the bottom left is of a sun tanning bed. FDA regulates those as medical devices because the sun tanning bed changes the skin, and so it's affecting the structure of the body. It also can be dependent on the claims. For example, if a product like a laser says it removes wrinkles versus reduces the appearance of wrinkles. Reducing the appearance is a cosmetic claim. Removing wrinkles is a device claim. And FDA also generally interprets the exclusions narrowly. There's very specific criteria. For example, FDA excludes general wellness products from the definition of device. And they have two alternative criteria for being a general wellness product. One is that it doesn't mention a disease or condition. The other one can mention a disease or condition, but it has to be widely recognized in published medical journals, et cetera, that there's a link between that action and use of that type of device and the health benefit for that type of disease or condition. And it has to be a low-risk device. And that's an exception because the FDA's exclusions from the definition of device often do not include the hardware. General wellness products actually do include the hardware if they're low risk. So why does it matter if you're a device? And it's because FDA has statutory authority to regulate devices. And the definition is used to distinguish a product that FDA doesn't regulate. For example, a consumer product, as shown on the top right, that's a car seat. FDA doesn't regulate a car seat. But if it were a neonatal transport device, basically a transportable incubator, then FDA would regulate it as a medical device. And it also distinguishes devices from other types of products. As I mentioned earlier, drugs. As shown in the middle picture, FDA does not regulate drugs under the device authorities, although they regulate drugs separately. It's also used to determine whether a component of the product is a part of a combination, includes a device and a drug and or biologic product. As shown at the bottom on the far right is a drug-eluting stent. And FDA would have primary jurisdiction over that Center for Devices Evaluation and Radiological Health because the stent contributes the primary mode of action and the stent is a device. The drug that it's coated with, which is just to reduce infection and help keep the vessel open, is a secondary mode of action. And FDA has a 3-tiered risk-based device classification system. Class 1 devices are the lowest risk, and they are subject to general controls, such as device establishment, registration, and listing with FDA. Most Class 1 devices are exempt from pre-market review. And some are also exempt from quality systems regulation, generally non-sterile products, such as non-sterile specimen containers. And for example, a 510K exempt device, an example is a mattress cover shown below. and a 510K reserve device, which means it's one of the few Class 1 devices that requires 510K clearance. An example is a manual wheelchair. Class 2 devices present moderate risk, and they are subject to general controls like Class 1 devices, plus special controls. And special controls are specific to that type of device. Most Class 2 devices require 510K pre-market review, but there are Class 2 510K exempt devices, such as a stethoscope, as shown in the bottom. And an example of a 510K reserve device, which requires clearance, is a electric wheelchair. The third is a Class 3 devices, which are the highest risk devices. And they cannot be assured the safety or effectiveness of them through general and special controls. So almost all of them require pre-market approval. The few that don't were a special category that existed more than 40 years ago, and we'll talk about them later. And the factors that can affect the device classification, an important one is the intended use of the product, what you're going to, the purpose of the product. For example, a cryosurgical system is 510K. There are 510Ks for these products for gynecological ablation. But if it's used for endometrial ablation, which is a gynecological type of ablation, it requires a PMA. The device's technological characteristics can also affect how it's classified. For example, a mercury thermometer, shown in the top image, is 510K exempt, and it's a Class 1 device. An electronic thermometer, shown in the lower image, is a Class 2 device that requires 510K clearance. And this is more of a theoretical situation, but an implanted thermocouple, which is a type of thermometer used with a heater to enhance the effectiveness of brachytherapy, probably would be a Class 3 PMA device if it was a permanent implant. So how do I find out how a device is classified? FDA has identified the class and type of pre-market submission for more than 1,700 generic device types across 16 medical specialties. If you know what type of product you think your device is, you start by looking at the device classification regulations, and you can do a search for type, just type in the name, and it will pull up a classification regulation, and the classification, and like the first paragraph, it's identification. It describes the device and it tells you the class. This one, Class 2. This one, which is surgical apparel, actually is a complex regulation because some surgical apparel are Class 2 devices and require 510K. Some are Class 2 and are 510K exempt. And then there's certain surgical apparel that are Class 1 devices that are 510K exempt. So it shows you, it separates them into Class 1 and Class 2 and describes both types of devices. FDA's product code database, and not every device classification regulation has at least one product code associated with it. Some device classification regulations have multiple product codes, like the surgical apparel, but not every product code has a classification regulation. So if you don't find it in your classification regulation, you can search FDA's product code database. Again, general term search. And this one tells you it's a 510K, and it also tells you what class the product is. So you get the same information you get in the classification regulation, and it refers you back to it. And if you know a similar device and don't know how it's classified, you can pull up the decision letter from FDA's website, and that will tell you again the product code and the classification regulation number. So you can go back in either the database, product code database, or the classification regulation and find out what type of submission it requires. And there are three primary types of pre-market submissions. The first, and the route that the vast majority of devices that require FDA authorization go down this route. It's the 510K pre-market notification. And about 95% of devices go through this route. And in a 510K pre-market notification, which is named after Section 510K of the Federal Food and Drug Cosmetic Act. You need to demonstrate that your device is substantially equivalent to a predicate device. And a predicate device is another 510K cleared device, a device to which FDA has granted de novo authorization, and we'll talk about that later, a Class 3 device that has been reclassified to Class 1 or Class 2. You cannot use a Class 3 device that requires a PMA as a predicate. A 510K exempt device, so a device that does not require FDA review, or a device that was on the market before May 28th, 1976, which is called a pre-amendments device and doesn't require FDA approval as it's grandfathered in if it's a Class 1 or Class 2 device. And to demonstrate that your device is substantially equivalent, it doesn't have to be identical, but it does have to have the same intended use as the predicate, and either the same technological characteristics or there are technological differences between the device, but those differences do not raise different questions of safety or effectiveness. Scientific methods exist for evaluating those differences, and performance data demonstrates that the new device is at least as safe and effective as the predicate. So it can be more safe and effective. It just has to be approximately the same. If the device is found substantially equivalent, FDA clears the device and it can be marketed. If it's found not substantially equivalent, the device can't be marketed unless authorization is obtained. And it can be either by filing a new 510K, if the reason the first 510K was not cleared was because more data or information was needed, and you provide the additional data or information in the second 510K for the product. It may require de novo authorization if the reason it was found not substantially equivalent is because it didn't have a predicate, and it's a low to moderate risk device. But it would require PMA approval if there was no predicate and it's a high risk device. If you don't respond to a request for additional information from FDA within 180 days of the request, the 510K is automatically withdrawn. FDA can also come back and tell you the product is 510K exempt, so they won't review the 510K, but you have an official decision by FDA it's exempt. Same thing as they can say they're exercising enforcement discretion and not regulating the product currently. And that is subject to change. Or they can say it's not a device. And those last three, they don't review the 510K, but they just make a decision. 510K user fees and review times. FDA has a user fee for 510K notices. In fiscal year 2022, which began on October 1st, 2021, the standard user fee for 510Ks was $12,745. The small business user fee was $3,186. To qualify as a small business and obtain the smaller business user fee, a company has to have less than or equal to $100 million in sales or revenue and be designated a small business by FDA. In 2020, the average time from submission of a 510K till FDA's final decision was 105 days. And that's an average. So there are 510Ks that took less time to review and 510Ks that took more time than 105 days. The first part of that elapsed time period is FDA's initial review. There's a 15-day refuse to accept review when FDA determines whether to accept the 510K for review. And if they do so, then the agency tries to provide substantive feedback to the submitter from 60 days of acceptance of the submission. So it would be a total of 60-day review period. On average, submitters take 38 days to respond to FDA, which may be a combination of several cycles, with FDA requesting information, the submitter responding, and then FDA reviewing it. But for ease and visual reference, we've lumped those periods together. The important thing is that average total time for review for FDA, which includes their RTA review, their substantive review, and the review of one or more responses was 67 days last year. So FDA met its review goal of reviewing 510Ks in less than or equal to 90 days. The second primary type of pre-market submission is de novo request regarding automatic Class 3 classification. And to qualify, you have to be a low to moderate risk device, and FDA cannot have classified that type of device. So there's no classification, regulation, or product code for that type of device. And therefore, there's no predicate for it. And there are two alternative routes to the de novo review. The first is filing a 510K and getting a not substantially equivalent determination from FDA, and then proceeding to de novo review. The second, you can go directly to de novo review if the company itself makes a determination there's no predicate. But FDA recommends that companies first submit a pre-submission to confirm that there's no predicate device, because FDA sometimes comes up with predicates that you didn't think about, especially if the agency wants to keep it in the 510K realm and not review a de novo for it. They may be creative with their predicates. And we also try to help our clients be creative in finding predicates. FDA grants de novo authorization if the device meets the criteria for a Class 1 or Class 2 device. Again, special and general controls are sufficient to assure the safety and effectiveness of the product. And there's valid scientific evidence. And then de novo submissions and requests generally require clinical data or include clinical data. And that clinical data provides a reasonable assurance the device is safe and effective for its indications. So it's a higher standard than a 510K, but as you'll see in a little bit, it's a lower standard than for PMA approval. And this is our interpretation of FDA's flowchart on what happens when they receive a de novo request and how they get to a final decision. I won't walk you through it because it includes the steps we basically talked about of, the refuse to accept review, a determination, a substantive review, a determination whether additional information is requested, and requests, and that can be multiple rounds of requests and responses, and then ultimately a determination. And what happens when FDA grants a de novo request? All devices within the same generic type are down classified to Class 1 or Class 2. The device that was the subject, because it's a specific device for which you file a de novo request, does not require 510K clearance. Each new device of that type, since they've been down classified, requires 510K clearance, but they can use the new device that was the subject of the de novo request as a predicate. So now there's predicates for that product. There are user fees associated with de novo submissions. It's $112,457 is a standard fee. It's $28,114 if a business qualifies and gets designated by FDA as a small business. And to do so, it has to have 100 million or less in sales or revenue. In 2020, the average total elapsed time, so from time of submission till FDA's final decision for de novo, was 248 days. Again, it's an average, so there were some that were longer than that and some that were shorter than that. FDA's portion of that total review time was averaged 135 days, and the submitter's time that it took to respond to FDA's request for additional information averaged 113 days. And again, it doesn't all FDA's review time up front and then the submitter's review time. It's piecemeal, but because there's no statutory requirements in here, it can be multiple rounds of reviews. So it may be more segmented than shown in this illustration. The third primary type of pre-market submission is PMAs, or pre-market approval applications. And pre-market approval applications are large multi-volume submissions. And these are the ones you typically hear most about on TV because they're usually novel devices that either make a significant benefit and safety or effectiveness of a product, or the first of the kind types of devices. And they include very detailed device descriptions. They often include engineering drawings and pictures of the device. They include draft labeling. They include extensive performance data and almost always includes clinical data. They have very detailed proprietary manufacturing information. And it's a very detailed review that FDA conducts. And it starts with a two-part pre-review. The first being an acceptance review to ensure that the submission is complete. Again, this is a checklist. Does it have all the required elements? And FDA makes a determination within 15 days, or it's automatically accepted. And then the agency immediately begins a filing review of the basic adequacy of the technical elements. So they look to make sure that it answers the general question and not whether it shows its safe and effectiveness, but whether there's a data that allows them to evaluate it. A PMA application is subject to the most rigorous review of devices. So it's a very lengthy, detailed review by the agency. It also, in many cases, FDA refers the PMA to an outside panel of experts that FDA convenes, and they review the PMA and they make recommendations to FDA about whether to approve it or not approve it. And in many cases, FDA follows their recommendations. And we've all become familiar with that process with the COVID-19 vaccines that they had very public FDA panel meetings. Those are biologics and not devices. And before approval of a PMA, FDA often requires quality system regulation audits. So they go to the manufacturer of the device and they make sure that their manufacturing, packaging, storage process follows the manufacturer's procedures for each of those steps and is consistent with FDA's quality system regulations. So it has to pass a QSR audit before FDA will approve the product. The FDA also often conducts bioresearch monitoring of the clinical study sponsor or the clinical study sites. And it may not be all the sites, but sometimes select sites in there. And they basically are verifying the data and checking that it was adequately monitored in there. And again, that usually has to be conducted before FDA will approve the PMA. So FDA's decisions on a PMA. FDA can issue an approval order if the agency determines that the device is safe and effective for its indications. So that's an absolute standard. It has to be both safe and effective, as opposed to de novo, which is reasonable assurance, and 510K, which is substantially equivalent to a predicate, which are lesser standards for showing safety and effectiveness, but they are safety and effectiveness evaluations. And the agency may impose conditions of approval on the device, such as requiring a post-market study. Many companies, before they get an approval order, get an approvable letter. And FDA says they believe the device can be approved if certain modifications are made. And they're usually generally fairly minor modifications, such as making labeling changes. And the applicant agrees to certain conditions, such as a post-market study. A not approvable letter, which is fairly common to receive, but it's always fairly devastating for companies, basically says FDA believes the PMA cannot be approved, or the PMA lacks sufficient FDA information for FDA to decide whether they can approve it. But then it goes on to list the deficiencies and identifies the information needed to make the PMA approval, if it's possible for FDA to identify that information. So the PMA isn't withdrawn. You can respond to the not approvable letter and provide the additional information. And FDA can also issue an order denying approval. And the user fees and review times for PMAs. For the standard user fee in fiscal year 2022, which by the way started on October 1st of 2021 is $374,580. So quite a bit larger than the approximately 12,000 for a, $112,000 for a de novo. The small business, again, less than 100 million sales, the user fee is $93,174. You have to be designated a small business by FDA. However, if you're a very small business, which means less than or equal to $30 million of sales and revenue per year, then the fee for the first PMA is waived, but only for the first PMA. Then you'd qualify for the small business fee for subsequent PMAs. The average total lapse time since the start of the submission to FDA's making a final decision in 2020 averaged 326 days. Again, some were longer, some were shorter than that. FDA's review goal was approximately 188 days. But in last year, FDA's total average review time was 190 days. So they exceeded their goal. And it was approximately equal. FDA's total average review time, 190 days, while submitters' average total response time was 127 days. And again, it can be broken up into various cycles. So a shorter FDA review period, then another response period from the company, and then another FDA review period. And this complicated looking flowchart describes the various paths to market. The first one we touched on briefly was the products that don't require FDA review. The Class 1 exempt devices, the Class 2 exempt devices, grandfathered devices, which were on the market and haven't changed since before May 28th, 1976, which, as you can imagine, given the time that's elapsed, and then there aren't many. Tongue depressors is a classic example. A wooden tongue depressor hasn't changed. It was on the market before then, hasn't changed since then, would not need clearance. Class 2 and Class 1 reserve devices, which require 510K clearance, and we went through the options, the 510K option, and then whether they would require de novo review if they're automatically classified in Class 3 before they're classified in Class 1 or Class 2 if they're granted, and pre-market approval, which we described, and two other processes which are less rarely used and we'll only touch on briefly at the end, was the humanitarian use device, which is basically for orphan type products. There's a population of less than 8,000 in the US, and product development protocols, which are rarely used. If the product has been classified, it doesn't qualify for de novo review, and you actually have to file a reclassification petition. But like with the de novo, the product, if it's successful, leads to down classification of advice from Class 3 to Class 1 or Class 2. By the way, it isn't shown in this chart, but FDA can actually up-classify devices as well. So devices that are classified as Class 1 or Class 2, or currently have product codes and regulated as Class 1 or Class 2, FDA can reclassify them either by their own initiative or by petition and request, up-classify them to Class 3 and require PMAs. In addition to the pre-market review, FDA also regulates the clinical studies of device. If the study is used to evaluate the safety effectiveness of the device, unless it's exempt from FDA's investigational device exemption, IDE regulations. But even if it is, if the data is intended to be used to support an IDE or pre-market submission, FDA regulates it. But this is for studies conducted in the US. We'll return in a moment to what happens if the study is conducted or part of the study is conducted outside the US. And all such studies must have institutional review board approval. They must obtain informed consent from the study subjects, except in certain emergencies when it's impossible to obtain consent. The patient's unconscious, it's a life-threatening situation, there's no guardian or friend, anyone present who can consent for the subject, then, and again, this is an unusual situation where it's part of a clinical study, but then they could waive informed consent. And you also have to disclose to potential subjects the types and amount of clinical investigators' financial interest in both the study sponsor and the product. And the clinical investigator includes immediate members of their family, and it's a very defined what those financial interests are. And the extent to which FDA regulates a clinical study depends on which of three categories the device study is classified and assigned to it. The first being a significant risk device study, second being a non-significant risk device study, and the third being IDE exempt study. And this is based on the study, so what the investigational plan is, and not necessarily the device per se. So you could have a device that doesn't present a great deal of risk, but used in a very risky way in a clinical study, and it may go from being a non-significant risk device to a significant risk. And obviously, the significant risk device are subject to the most regulatory oversight by FDA. So what is the significant risk device study? FDA defines it, and it says it presents a potential for serious health, safety, or welfare risk, and at least one of the following three applies. It's intended for use as an implant. It's intended for use in supporting or sustaining human life, or it's for use of substantial importance in diagnosing, curing, mitigating, or treating disease, or otherwise preventing impairment of human health. That last criteria, the substantial equivalence, substantial importance, gives FDA broad discretion to put something into or take it out of the significant risk category. By, for example, they don't want to regulate a significant risk study. They can say it's not substantial importance and doesn't meet that criteria. But if they want to, preventing impairment of human health and being of substantial equivalence in doing so is pretty broad. And so FDA can generally put a study into that category if they want to. And SR, significant risk device studies, require FDA approval of an IDE application. So a submission to FDA must be approved by the agency. And some examples of devices that clinical studies of which are commonly considered to be significant risk: hemodialyzers, cochlear implants, extended wear contact lenses are some examples. We're going to skip then to the third category of IDE exempt clinical studies. And these are studies in humans, so they don't include veterinary products, are exempt from IDE requirements. So they don't need an IDE application to FDA, and they don't have to comply with FDA's other reporting and record keeping requirements regarding investigational devices. If it's a study of a legally marketed device for its FDA of authorized indication. So if it's a 510K cleared device, for example, that is being tested for the indications for which FDA cleared it, it could be legally marketed for that purpose, so FDA does not regulate it as an investigational device, and FDA authorization is not required for that testing, clinical testing of the product. Other exempt types of devices are non-invasive diagnostic devices, but they have to comply with the labeling requirements for an investigational in vitro diagnostic device. They can't require invasive sampling that presents a significant risk. So venipuncture would take most of these products out of this category. They can't introduce energy into the body, and they can't be the sole basis for diagnosing a subject during the clinical study. They have to be confirmed by a medically accepted diagnostic practice or procedure. Testing for consumer preference also are exempt from the IDE regulations or modifications to a legally marketed device, only if they're not being used for the purpose of determining the device's safety and effectiveness, which consumer preference testing should not be testing for safety or effectiveness, and they don't put the subject at risk. So the middle category, FDA doesn't define what's a non-significant risk clinical device study. So by default, it's a device study that's neither a significant risk device study as defined by FDA, or an exempt device study as indicated by FDA. Non-significant risk device studies must comply with an abbreviated set of IDE requirements. The sponsor doesn't have to submit an IDE application to FDA to obtain approval for the study. A non-significant risk device study is deemed to have an FDA-approved IDE. And some examples of devices that the types of studies are generally considered to be non-significant risk are Foley catheters, shown in the top image, and daily wear contact lenses. So extended wear, significant risk; non-significant risk is daily wear. So who makes substantial equivalent, significant risk, non-significant risk determination? Study sponsor makes the initial determination, and it's based on clinical input from physicians, nurse practitioners, on whether it meets the significant risk criteria. And it remains a non-significant risk device unless one or more reviewing IRBs determine its significant risk, and FDA doesn't reverse that decision. So one IRB says it's significant risk, it's a significant risk device unless FDA overrules that IRB's determination, or if FDA says it's a significant risk device. As promised, we're kind of returning to the discussion of non-US clinical studies. IDE requirements do not apply to studies conducted outside the US because FDA does not have jurisdiction over studies conducted outside the US. And significant risk device studies can be conducted outside the US without an FDA-approved IDE. But the risk is that FDA would not accept the data because FDA hasn't had input into the study. So most sponsors include some US study sites and non-US study sites. If they have non-US study sites, they include some US study sites because FDA prefers it. And what FDA gets feedback on the IDE approval for the US study sites, companies often make the non-US study sites comply with the same requirements or make it the same protocol, make it consistent with the US data so they can be pooled and interpreted by FDA when FDA reviews a pre-market submission, because you'd have to include the foreign data, non-US data, in the pre-market submission to FDA. And FDA can approve a 510K or a PMA based solely on non-US data, but it's rare for the agency to do so because they want to see that the data is applicable to the US population. So if it's all non-US data, there has to be a justification and an explanation why it is applicable to the US. And then it's a judgment call by FDA whether they accept that. So an IDE application contains a detailed description of the device, a description of the manufacturing process, facilities, and controls, but less detailed than typically in a PMA because it's evolving, and a report of prior investigations, often called a ROPI, that summarizes prior bench, animal, and any previous clinical testing that's already been conducted on the device, and an investigational plan for the proposed clinical study. Again, if it's a significant risk device, FDA must approve the IDE application before the company can conduct the study. So flipping it to the other side, instead of saying what the grounds for approval, FDA says what is the grounds for disapproving an IDE or drawing its approval of an approved IDE. And basically, the sponsor hasn't complied with the regulations of the statute, that it hasn't complied with any conditions of approval of the IDE that FDA or reviewing IRB imposed. It contains untrue statement or omission of a material fact. The applicant fails to respond to a request for additional information from the agency within the time prescribed by FDA. This is the most common one, that the risks to the study subjects are not outweighed by the anticipated benefit to the subjects or the importance of the knowledge to be gained. So it's kind of written in the reverse. Basically, the benefits have to outweigh the risks, or FDA has determined that the knowledge to be gained outweighs the risk for FDA to approve it. Otherwise, they would disapprove the study. They can also disapprove it if the informed consent was inadequate, the investigation as proposed is scientifically unsound, there's reason to believe that the device is not effective as it's proposed to be used, or it's unreasonable to begin or conduct the clinical study due to the way the device is used or because of the inadequacy of the report of prior investigations or the investigational plan for future testing, or the inadequacy of the methods, facilities, and controls used in the manufacturing, processing, storage, etc. of the device, or the monitoring and review of the investigational plan is inadequate. So there's nobody checking or not sufficiently checking that the data recorded is what was actually occurring during the clinical study. So the potential decisions in an IDE. It can be approved, and then you can conduct the clinical study of your device. It can be approved with modifications. So FDA says, we want to approve it as you propose, but if you do this, this, and this, or make this, this, and this change, then it's approved, and you can go ahead and conduct the clinical study. It can be disapproved. It can be, the approval can be withdrawn, and as we discussed above, it can be determined that it's not a device and therefore not subject to the IDE regulations, or it's a non-significant risk, which then you get good to go with your clinical study. You can start the clinical study, but it doesn't have an FDA approval to do so. There's no user fee for IDEs. And unlike the pre-market submission, where you can go through multiple cycles and the process continues, what FDA does is they review it in 30-day cycles. So after 30-day review, you get a decision from FDA, which could be approval, approval with modifications, disapproval, etc. And it doesn't stop based on if you get a disapproval decision. You can then answer the deficiency in the disapproval letter and continue the process. But every 30 days, you're going to get a decision from FDA. So in terms of talking cumulative time, it's more how many cycles you go through than actual number of days. And in fiscal year 2020, FDA received 346 IDEs, again, all for significant risk devices, or should have been all for significant risk devices. They approved 205 of them on the first cycle. So after 30 days, 59.2% of them were approved. Now, it's a little deceptive because most IDE studies, you submit a pre-submission before you submit the IDE. So you work out most of the issues with FDA before you actually file the 510K. So it's not like 30 days after you first approach FDA, you've got an approval for FDA to begin your study. Most of the work has been done before the IDE is submitted. Another 27% get IDE approval after the second cycle, so that's 67% total. Another 3 out of 346 after the third cycle, so we're up to about 68% after 3 review cycles, and then just one more after the fourth cycle. Again, this is data from a year ago, 68%. So after 4 cycles of 30 days each, a little less than 70% of all IDEs are approved. There were 14 in that year that were disapproved after the first cycle, and none of them proceeded to answer the disapproval and continue. I think it's such a big decision now, given the pre-submissions, that if you're getting a disapproval, there's something pretty major wrong with your proposed investigational plan or your report of prior investigation or the device itself, that most companies go back to the drawing board, and they may later submit a new IDE, but they don't continue the review of that IDE. And then the other category, because those numbers don't add up to 346, again, it's not a device, it's not significant risk, or the company decides to withdraw the IDE. And even after the IDE is approved and the company is conducting a clinical study, FDA can put it on clinical hold if it determines and then stops the study temporarily or possibly permanently if the agency determines it presents an unreasonable risk to study subjects. And by the way, during a clinical study, patients are called subjects. So that's usually how you can tell when they're referring to a study versus actual commercial use of a product. They're subjects versus patients. And in determining whether a study presents an unreasonable risk to the study subjects and to halt the study, FDA can consider a number of factors, such as the clinical investor's qualifications, information about the device, the design of the clinical investigation, the condition that's being tested, and the health of the study subjects. If FDA puts a study in clinical hold and the sponsor can address FDA's grounds for doing so, then FDA can remove the hold and the study can resume. And that is often the case. So as promised, we're going to talk about one specific example that we were involved in getting 510K clearance for the first of its kind hair growth device. And the company wanted to obtain FDA authorization to market a brush that delivers laser light to the scalp to regrow hair in men who are balding. And they not only wanted to get that authorization, but they wanted to be the first device that FDA authorized. The agency expressed doubt before the company submitted their application to FDA, their submission to FDA, that they could actually clear a 510K for the device, even if clinical data demonstrated safety and effectiveness for that purpose, because there was no predicate. So they weren't saying they couldn't authorize the device to be marketed. They were just saying the 510K route probably wasn't going to work because being the first of the kind, there was no predicate. So what we did, because the company wanted to get it as quickly as possible, and the 510K route is generally a quicker route to market and less expensive, we realized that we would need to have clinical data, so we needed to demonstrate the safety and effectiveness of the device for its proposed indication for growing hair. But we created a mix of predicate devices to convince FDA to keep it within the 510K realm. So the multiple predicate devices, we used a 510K cleared laser with a different wavelength, which was used for removing hair. We cleared 510K lasers with the same wavelength that were for different therapeutic uses. So they weren't for growing hair, but it was showing that the wavelength was safe and effective for other purposes, and FDA had authorized it. We used a 510K cleared device that didn't use laser, but delivered electric energy to the scalp to remove lice and a psoriasis comb. And the purpose of those was to show that a comb or brush could be used to direct the energy to the scalp. So getting through the hair and getting it to the place where it needed to be effective for the therapeutic purpose. And we also used a 1890, and again, that's correct, more than 100-year-old device for treating baldness, which was a pre-amendments device. It wasn't FDA reviewed, but it was on the market, so it could be used as a pre-amendments predicate device. And then, of course, we had clinical data that was evaluating the safety and effectiveness of this device for regrowing hair. So we submitted the 510K to FDA, and based on FDA's expressed skepticism on whether the 510K could be cleared, and the somewhat mixed study results, we weren't sure how FDA was going to respond to this 510K. Because they could have found it not substantially equivalent because there was no predicate and required de novo review. And because the clinical data showed that study subject perceived more hair growth than the clinical investigators, that FDA could have said, okay, the results aren't definitive and we require more clinical data, either in a 510K or in a de novo. However, we were able to negotiate a modification to the wording of the indications to allow FDA to clear the 510K based on the clinical data, which was a big victory for our client. And they received considerable publicity being the first FDA cleared hair growth product. And then they were able to force their competitors who did not have 510K clearance off the market until they obtained 510K clearance for FDA. So it was a major win for our client. And as promised, I'm going to talk to you, give you a couple of quick regulatory tips on the FDA. And I always try, this is like the most important 5 minutes of a approximately 1 hour discussion. Because if you're going to remember anything from what I say, this is usually my experience, the type of things that people remember about the regulatory process. First, correctly identify the type of submission. 510K, it's 510, open parentheses, K, small k, close parentheses. And it refers to section 510K, section 510K, subsection K of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which authorizes FDA to require 510K submissions. And this is a common typo that people call it a 501K. They put a capital K, they don't put parentheses, or they confuse it in the US with our retirement savings plan, a 401K. Some reviewers completely ignore it. Others point this out and they kind of drive companies crazy. So it's one that's good to do a global search if you do a submission or refer to it and make sure you've got it written correctly. De novo review. And again, this is devices that are automatically classified into class 3. They don't have classification regulations or product codes that are describing them as class 3 because FDA hasn't reviewed any device of that type. It's the first of its kind. So de novo is Latin for new. And so it's a new review of its automatic class 3 classification. Because it's Latin, it's italicized. So again, global search when you write something to make sure that you italicize de novo. And you'll sound like a pro. The second regulatory tip is each type of submission has a specific descriptive names. So the term submission applies broadly across the types of pre-market requests for FDA to authorize the marketing of a device. But 510Ks are notices or notifications. And that's because initially companies were notified FDA 90 days before they intended to market a device. And if FDA didn't object by the end of the 90 days, they could go to market without any response from FDA. But companies rarely did so because it was too risky, because they could, a day later get the letter in the mail from FDA saying they had questions and it wasn't substantially equivalent. So most companies waited until they got the decision. And subsequently, FDA changed it. So now you actually have to get a decision from FDA to go to the market. So the notification part of it isn't really a notification anymore, but we still call it that. And if you call it a 510K notice and not an application, you'll sound very knowledgeable about the FDA regulatory process. De novo is a request. And again, this is a historical fact, is that you used to have to file a 510K and be found not substantially equivalent before you could proceed to de novo. So you got a not substantial equivalent determination from FDA, and then you had to request the review of the automatic class 3 classification. So again, it's called a request. And this is, again, the process of elimination option. It's that the 510K is too small. There isn't a predicate. And the PMA is too big. FDA doesn't want to have to go through the very complicated review process for a PMA to review this. So it's a default strategy. 510K is too small, PMA is too big, we'll try the de novo. And a PMA is actually an application to FDA, and it includes very defined information, very specific requirements in there, and you're formally asking FDA to evaluate the device for its proposed indications, including reviewing the labeling for the product and making a formal approval or disapproval decision ultimately on the product. When FDA first started regulating devices, again, May 28, 1976, it was expected that all devices would eventually go through the PMA process, and that the 510K process was considered a stopgap because there were so many devices already in the market, FDA couldn't all of a sudden review these lengthy submissions for all of them. And it actually turned out to be the reverse. The vast majority of devices go through the 510K process. A small percentage, like 45, 50, devices a year go through a brand new PMA process. So it's the smallest process, but it is the most rigorous. And just in terms of terminology, a reclassification is a petition. So we have 510K notices, de novo requests, PMA applications, and reclassification petitions. Sound like a genius if you use the correct terms. Same type of thing of what FDA's authorization, how you describe it. For a 510K, it's clearance. It's not an approval. There's not a 510K approval. It's a clearance of the device that is found substantially equivalent. De novo is a down classification, or you can say that the de novo was granted. A PMA is actually an approval, and a classification petition is reclassified, or you could also call it down classified. And I promised to talk to you about the product development protocol when I put on the complicated flowcharts of the various paths to market. And while it's described as an alternative to a PMA, the tip is it's not a viable alternative to a PMA. What it involves is the company and FDA reaching agreement requiring the required information data early in the review process for the device. And then the company going and getting the data and collecting the information, and then they submit a notice of completion to FDA when the company has satisfied those requirements. And that's supposed to be sufficient to approve it. But it's very hard to reach agreement ahead of time on this, and things change. So this process has seldom, if ever, been successfully used. So I don't even go in any detail in my presentations about it because it really isn't a viable alternative. Now, if you're going to remember only one date, there's one really important date for the device regulation, and that's May 28th, 1976. And on that date, the medical device amendments to the Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act were enacted. Congress had passed it and the president signed it. So FDA began regulating medical devices as medical devices on that date. Prior to that date, they had regulated a few devices as drugs. And those are called transitional devices. But this is when FDA truly began regulating most medical devices. So devices separate into two categories. Those that were on the market prior to that date, which are called pre-amendment. And again, if it's the same exact device and it's a class 1 or class 2 that was on the market as of that date, tongue depressor example, it's grandfathered and doesn't require clearance. Or if it's in that category of class 3 devices for which FDA has not called for PMAs. So for years, there were many types of class 3 devices for which FDA has not called for PMAs. FDA has whittled that down greatly, and if there's very few that still remain in that category of class 3 pre-amendments devices for which they can submit 510Ks until FDA calls for PMAs. And then there were the devices that are first marketed as of a date, which are called post-amendments devices. And they must comply with all FDA requirements that are applicable to the device class. Some of those devices don't have classification regulations, but once a product is cleared or approved in those classifications, they at least have a product code. Now, I said there's only one date to remember, that there are other couple of key dates that are helpful to know. 1992 is the first date that FDA initially began requiring 510K summaries or statements in 510Ks. So what that means is 510Ks either have to include a summary of what's in the submission, or they have to include a statement that within 30 days of request by any party, they will provide a copy of the entire 510K with only confidential or commercial trade secret information redacted from it. Most companies file a 510K summary. But there was a lot of pushback on that when it first was FDA proposed it and enacted it in 1992. So they stayed it for about 2 years. So in 1994, they instituted that requirement. So as of 1994, when you look up a 510K for a product, it should have either a 510K summary or 510K statement. In 1994, we didn't have the internet like we do now, so you had to request the 510K summaries from FDA. So more recent 510K summaries are all posted online within about a month of the clearance of this device. If you go back further, some of them are not online. They just didn't go back and put them all online, but you can request them and get them quickly from FDA. Again, if it's a 510K statement, you have to order it from FDA. But that's a good date to know, because if you're looking for one and don't see it, then you know sort of this should be either a statement or summary. And then in 1996, FDA began requiring indications for use statements for 510Ks. So it said specifically what the purpose of the device was. And FDA clears the device for that specific purpose listed on the indications for use statement, but also indicates whether the product is prescription use or OTC use. And so since that, as of that date, anything that the device is not specifically cleared for in their indications for use statement arguably is an off-label use of the product, which is a subject of a different talk. So I will stop now and say thank you very much for listening to this presentation.